Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Hi, good morning. My name is David Feeney, and thank you for joining us today, this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be, to talk about what 2018 has in store for business continuity professionals. Again, I'm David Feeney. My co-host, co-facilitator is Andrea Lestarge.
Hello.
We'll start off with very brief introductions. As far as background, I have about 17 years of experience in the risk management and business continuity space. I kind of came up through physical security and created a niche for myself in the converged space between physical and cybersecurity. From a risk management perspective and a business continuity perspective, kind of early on in my career, and I've lived there since then. I have a lot of experience primarily in the energy and utilities sector, but almost exclusively in the private sector. And a lot of that experience is operational, so security operations, technology like access control and video system, project management and implementation, GSOC design, GSOC management, that kind of thing. I'll introduce my co-facilitator, Andrea, for a brief introduction from her.
Thanks, Dave. Yep, as you said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those who are joining us. I think first and foremost, I definitely want to say thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for the commitment that you have to this topic by joining us. As Dave said, my name is Andrea Lestarge. I am a manager at Deloitte. I've been with the firm for almost 3 years. That kind of made my jaw drop the other day as I realized I'm approaching my 3rd year anniversary. It's gone very quick with the firm. My specialty within the firm is to advise clients on cyber and physical risk components. We'll talk about those in future slides here. I work primarily in the energy sector along with Dave, though my secondary industry is the public sector. There I advise clients on strategic and operational plans, typically aimed at responding to significant cyber events, but definitely a convergence that we have with physical and cyber. And we will also talk about that soon. Prior to joining the firm, I worked in the federal and state landscape. I actually, if somebody had asked me 10 years ago where I would be, I never would have said I'm here. I started off as an English teacher and had a passion for criminal justice, and that grew into Homeland Security after the United States suffered some terrorist attacks. So I've now, in that realm, in that environment, I worked with the federal and state agencies, going around and really teaching first responders the importance of risk assessments, whether that's physical or cyber, and acknowledging all of the components that go into that analysis. So thanks again for being here. That's a little brief overview of me, and Dave, I'll turn it right back over to you.
Thank you. So we'll start with the agenda. Briefly, I'll just summarize it. We're going to start by kind of baselining some terminology and some basics that we'll talk about over the next hour or so. We'll spend a lot of time talking about threats, cyber threats, data breach, Internet of Things, probably all concepts that this audience is at least somewhat familiar with, and physical security threats as well. And then we'll start talking about the impact of those threats on the process of business continuity planning. Now, as we're talking about all these things, this is not like a top 10 list or anything like that. We're just going to be talking about threats and impact on planning. Everything that we talk about is a trend that we expect to have an impact on our space in 2018, whether it be an emerging trend or persistent trend or both. As we're talking through this subject matter, basically everything that we say will pertain to a trend that we expect to have an impact on in 2018. Excuse me.
All right, Dave. So team, I'm going to actually take over the next couple of slides. And without a doubt, I'll be transitioning a little bit to Dave just so that we can break this up and have it be a little bit more conversational. So to begin, let's level set on our terminology. As mentioned in my short bio, I'm really big on the methodology of analyzing risk. And I typically defer to the DHS methodology, though there's many agencies that also use this methodology. And it's looking at these three components of threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. Now, what I like about this is that the calculation itself is actually about the function of these three and how they interact with each other, which is why this Venn diagram is a perfect visual. Where they overlap is where they have a interdependency. So think to yourself, potentially, the amount of time somebody has said, you know, what's the threat to our company? What's the threat to this business process? We can have a whole slew of threats, and none of them are weighted, because to one person, it might be something that keeps them up at night, and to the other person, it's going to be a whole different topic that keeps them up at night. So what this methodology helps us do is say, in that bucket of all possible threats, what are actually the vulnerabilities, the weak links within my business process that would allow this threat to be successful? If I only concentrate on threats and I do not acknowledge the weak links that would allow that threat to be successful, all I'm really doing is naming threats. I'm not honing in on the prioritized threats, the most probable scenarios of concern. Additionally, I need to look at what are these threats in the function of consequence. Bad guys are not going to want to do bad things if there's no reward for them. And in addition, we've got what's on the bottom, the vulnerabilities and the function of consequence, because if there is no weak link, I don't need to worry as much about the impact because I have some type of security of structure or of network. What these blue call-out boxes allow us to acknowledge is, now let's put on the hat of the bad guy, the adversary. The threat and the vulnerability function helps us say, what's the likelihood of that adversary's capability? What would be the unfortunate weak links in our system that's going to allow the actor's intent or threat to actually be successful, that capability piece? On the flip side, that bad guy is not going to want to deploy any tactic if it's not worth his intent. In other words, if it's not going to be worth me getting caught or harmed or even potentially killed, that may not be a big enough bang for my buck to actually deploy that threat. So again, those functions all help us to acknowledge that as we look at each one of those circles and the function that it has with the other circle, and then even in the middle, the very center of this where all three actually overlap, that is our most probable risk. And that is what should keep us up at night versus this whole plethora of larger topics in those other buckets. Now, you're probably saying, Andrea, this is about risk, and I am attending a webinar on business continuity. That's actually one of the trends that we first start off with in 2018. We acknowledge that business continuity and risk management are not synonymous, but there's this discussion that's occurring in our environment that acknowledges business continuity is actually dependent. It's related to risk management. It's for all of the reasons that I just stated. business continuity in your program, it's not going to be a relevant, true, or validated process if you are not concentrating on the most probable threats, vulnerabilities, consequences because of this risk formula that we just went through. So acknowledge to yourself in the top right diagram, yes, we've got threats, yes, we've got vulnerabilities. They kind of teeter-totter on this seesaw going back and forth, but when the threats and the vulnerabilities actually overlap, that's when a ball will go up in the air, and now we have a consequence of basically that glass ball falling and breaking. Dave, any other comments on this slide?
No, I mean, that was very well put. I mean, I think just, you know, to, excuse me, kind of paint a picture, you know, if your business continuity program is well aligned with your risk management program, then that's terrific. And if the relationship between business continuity and security folks is strong, then that's terrific as well. It's not like this isn't happening. It's just that the importance is growing. And I think that's just natural with the way our threats are evolving and technology is so ubiquitous. So, excuse me. If they're not aligned, the importance of becoming aligned is that you won't spin your wheels dealing with risks that don't have that don't warrant the attention that you're giving them. So the risk management process basically identifies the threats to which a function is vulnerable, and then business continuity can take that and run with it and say, okay, you know, how is this going to affect the continuity of our operations, and what do we need to do to address that? An oversimplified example would be, you know, that a snowstorm or a blizzard is a very credible threat unless the organization you're dealing with is in Ecuador, where it never snows. So any effort spent on mitigating the threat or assuring the continuity of operations due to a snowstorm in Ecuador is pretty futile. Andrea, I think, not to put you on the spot, but you have an example about with experience in the state government sector?
I do. You know, you're making me, as I pause, there's a great example that you just brought up, is this acknowledgement that sometimes based on season or even based on time of day, we might have a change in the overall environment of where we're calculating risk. So Dave, you mentioned the exact, I'm looking out my window here in Wisconsin in the United States, and we have snow. So that would be a very important caveat in doing a risk assessment about the weather. What I've also noticed is about the time of day. So we were asked to do a risk assessment on our state capitol during steady state. There, you know, from people being in the Capitol perspective, there's risks naturally. There's threats and vulnerabilities and consequences, but because of the notion of amount of people to the law enforcement that we have there, the amount of consequences of those people getting hurt, it was pretty low, and that's a great thing. Now, flip that and acknowledge that in February 2012, we had over 100,000 people in our Capitol for a particular topic, and that completely changed the landscape of our steady state risk assessment. We were now operating in the mode of, we've got this contingency, we've got this caveat in the environment that now we have all of these people. And the also interesting piece was to acknowledge, are these people the threat? Is the notion of 100,000 people in a building that could, you know, probably only stand 70,000, is that now a threat? Or is it actually a vulnerability because they're not doing anything wrong? It's an adversary from the outside that could do something. So now you have this interplay again between, are they the threat? Not necessarily. They're actually more of the vulnerability. So I think in hopefully giving you that example, it's that notion of anytime you are calculating risk and figuring out what is the impact to the business processes, try to look at it from various angles and what's going to change some of those lenses that you look through. Dave, I think in interest of time, I'll have you go to the next slide.
Sure.
Thank you.
You should see that now.
Yep, we see it. All right, so team, we're going to dive deeper. We just talked about threats. And what's also really interesting is knowing that an adversary is sometimes going to do things intentional, definitely, right? But we also have this notion of sometimes our bad guys are actually the good guys doing something wrong on accident. And so the next slide helps us dive deeper into the who, what, and how of adversaries. We're going to specifically concentrate on cyber because it's going to actually transition us into our next trend. But we suggest that business continuity professionals need to lead the discussion about who might be motivated to attack us. And when we answer this question, that's actually getting back to the intent. Who actually is motivated to attack us? Now, examples of that might be cyber criminals, hacktivists, skilled individual hackers, nation states. We've also got on the flip side this notion of insider threat. And maybe it's the third party that we're dealing with, or our competitors might be trying to, unfortunately hit us at the knees so that they gain the advantage. We also suggest that business continuity professionals ask this second blue box on the left-hand side, what are the adversaries after? That would be prioritizing our consequences, right? The impact. As we look at these examples, theft of intellectual property or strategic plans, think of to yourself blueprints, the special sauce ingredients, financial fraud, reputation damage, business disruption. These are all examples of what we often refer to as the CIA model. CIA is an acronym. It's not the intelligence agency. It is standing for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So what are my bad guys going to do to hurt me? They're going to probably try to ruin the confidentiality I have within my employees and with my clients, whoever that may be, maybe buyers of my product, because I'm storing some type of personal identifying information. It also might be the integrity of my logo, the fact that I have this seal that you can trust me, and now a hacker proves that that's maybe not going to happen anymore. And the availability of my data. The last blue box is another question that we encourage business continuity professionals to ask, and that's how much risk are we really willing to accept? My bad guys are always going to deploy some type of tactic. It's a notion of acknowledging which out of these are going to be the ones that we can combat, and that might be low-hanging fruit, and which are the ones that we really want to have some type of program or strategic plan to combat. Examples here would be spear phishing or phishing for a larger net, software, hardware vulnerabilities, third-party compromise, and even think to yourself from a Mumbai-style attack where you've got multiple bad guys doing multiple bad things in one area from a physical perspective. We can actually have that same type of attack in a cyber environment where hackers or hacktivists are doing multiple different attacks on us to shut down various milestones within our business process. Once these questions are answered, then the entire organization can rely on technologists, and I would also say just subject matter experts in general, to figure out what kinds of attacks or techniques, tactics, procedures the adversaries are going to use. Dave, any other comments with this slide?
No, I think I would just kind of put a bow on this theme, right? Because you're seeing the theme here, right? There's a lot of talk, as Andrea said, about risk and risk management. And what we're talking about here is basically taking a step back earlier in the life cycle of an incident, right? So you have this spectrum that starts with identifying risk on one end, and goes through, identifying and deciding what strategy to take and mitigating and so on and so forth. And then an incident actually occurring, excuse me, emergency response, business continuity plans come into play all the way through the end. So that handoff, basically where an incident would occur, we're suggesting that in 2018, it will be important to take a step back earlier in that process and understand more about what the risk management people are doing, and how that assessment, identification, and strategy decision is, how that all plays out. And part of the reason that that's important is that, and many of you have probably experienced this, unfortunately, risk management and business continuity operate very differently. So risk management will look at, sometimes, especially within physical security, we'll look at a facility, right? Or not a function, right? And they'll identify risks there. And then as business continuity professionals, we have to basically translate that into impact and create a continuity plan for operations as a result. Facility is relevant, but that's only one piece, right? So that, things can slip through the cracks in that process. And if the risk management people extend themselves into understanding more about the business continuity process, business continuity professionals in turn extend themselves to understanding more about the risk management process. The more of that happens, the more aligned the entire spectrum, the entire process will be, and the more effective both departments will be.
Thanks, Dave.
Sure. I will advance the slide.
Thank you. So, team, this next slide, and really up to this point, we've stated the importance of analyzing threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. We've acknowledged the benefit of asking ourselves, who would harm us, what would they do to harm us, and how are they going to deploy that mechanism to harm us? We acknowledge that a persistent trend in business continuity for 2018 is this whole thing that we always face, seems like every single day, is new technologies. What are those new technologies? Well, we've included some examples in these blue dots on the left-hand side of our circle diagram, calling out just a couple of examples. We've got the cloud. Naturally, we are going to store a lot of information on there because it's a safety net, or in the fear that we always have of, oh my goodness, if I lose my phone, if I lose my laptop, if my laptop crashes, what am I going to do with those trade secrets, the blueprints that I have? So we store a lot of important files on cloud. And then, of course, we have mobile devices, social media, social abilities. We've got the analytics and shared services, all of those different technologies. These existing technological innovations bring us fantastic opportunities from a business perspective. They drive down costs. They increase our integration with our colleagues. Think about what we're doing right now. I see that we have almost 200 people on this webinar from all over the world, and we're being united because of this webinar, this technology. And it's also driving efficiencies. We can do things swifter because the speed of a computer is oftentimes faster than the speed of humans. But these new technologies also equal new threats. We have various threat actors on the right-hand side in these green bubbles, acknowledging that any one of them could try to penetrate, and if successfully, it would definitely cause us a headache, to say the least, on any of the blue technologies on the left. I really think, here it's this notion, Dave says it best, we can't stop new technology, and we would be foolish to not accept new technology. But what we really need to acknowledge is, again, this is going to be a caveat of looking back at our risk formula, looking back at how this new technology is, yes, an advantage, but also potentially a disadvantage if it were to be hacked in our business processes. Dave, I think that this is a great point to transition over to you on the next slide, and we can really roll up our sleeves and go into cyber.
Sure, sounds good. You know, Andrew makes a good point. Like if the world would just stop being innovative, like we could probably get ahead of these risks. And
Right.
obviously that's not going to happen. But you know, Uber is the one that always occurs to me. You know, like the private independent contractors driving their own cars, you know, as a taxi service. Yep. Okay. Never thought of that before. So now that that exists, okay, now we're going to have to, you know, do some risk management and business continuity planning surrounding this disruptive solution that I couldn't have even dreamed of, you know, 10 years ago. So, moving right along, we're going to start getting a bit more specific about about threats, most of which are persistent. In other words, I wouldn't most of these I wouldn't call brand new. I think all of us have experience with these threats that we're going to talk through. I'm not going to read from the slides. I'll just you know, give you color commentary as you kind of take some of these stats in. But what we're looking at here, you know, specific to cyber, are some, you know, pretty impressive / frightening statistics about threats like data breach, ransomware, phishing. You know, I can't believe the stat on phishing that, like, if you're a bad guy, that's got to be enormous success that 30% of phishing emails would be open and 12% would actually click the link or the attachment. Data loss and insider threat, you know, most of these threats, unfortunately, are not going away anytime soon, if ever. Insider threat would certainly be one. And then, you know, vulnerability management on the bottom right, we're talking about, you know, software vulnerabilities, and you know, again, that's, if you're a bad guy, that's an amazing proof point. You know, and it's interesting to me that, you know, and I'm not criticizing here, but we, as an industry, as a group, we spent a lot of time on, you know, keeping up with the you know, the emerging threats and the most advanced cybersecurity threat mitigation that we can you know, possibly think of. And then incidents occur, and it seems like what's exploited is always kind of pertains to the basics. You know, like you hear about terrible data pilferage, and it turns out that there was a patch available to prevent it, and it just hadn't been patched. So we should be you know, keeping up on the leading / bleeding edge, but also we don't want to lose focus on the fact that we have got to cover the basics. Looking specifically at data breach, you know, I think what I would take from this slide, and again, I'm not, you know, these statistical slides I'm not going to bother reading, but I think what we want to take from this slide is that data breaches are very quick to execute, and they're very lucrative. The loss of only 1,000 records in a data breach, almost reaching up to $100,000. I mean, and 1,000 records is nothing. So, you know, the cost is significant. The attack takes very short time to execute, and it's prevalent. I mean, the data breach, you know, they used to say there's two types of organizations, you know, the ones that have been breached and the ones that haven't been breached yet. And now it almost seems like the two types of organizations are those that have been breached and know it, and those that have been breached and do not know it. That kind of segues into my next slide here. There's a lot to take in here and to unpack, and you know, I won't take us too far into the weeds, but the statistic on this page that jumps out at me is this on the right-hand side, 229 days that attackers are able to maintain a presence in the network in between gaining access and being detected. So that's the trifecta right there. We're talking about a threat that's prevalent, takes minutes to execute, and on average, that's an average number. You could have 229 days to do all kinds of bad stuff before being detected. So when you take in these other stats and you think about what I just said, this is definitely a threat that's not going away. And the consequences from data breach, I mean, you hear about some data breaches where the consequences are almost meaningless because of the response, right? And that kind of takes me to the point. If this is such a prevalent threat that some people have almost accepted is just going to happen to them sooner or later, then business continuity planning could not be more important. You know, there are threats like, there are other threats like, you know, active shooter, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but that's the other one where, you know, if some security practitioners would tell you that if a person gets in their head that they're going to be an active shooter, then it's extraordinarily difficult to prevent that from happening. But you can minimize, maybe even eliminate the impact with proper business continuity planning. So I'll move on to the next slide, but that's, you know, in this day and age with technology progressing like it does, and just the state of the world, the number of threats that I would categorize that way is growing at a frightening pace, you know, and the more that continues, and I believe it's just going to continue for the foreseeable future, the more important business continuity planning becomes. Because it is certainly, you know, outsiders to the industry, you know, you have conversations with people and it becomes kind of apparent sometimes that, you know, the regular guy thinks that nothing ever happens, you know, like so long, you'll go so long before, you know, there's an actual incident that requires a response. And us in the industry know that that couldn't be further from the truth. Stuff happens all the time. And the more that continues to increase, the more important business continuity planning will be. Andrea, any comments on that?
So I think this is also where I want to also highlight for the members on the phone. You know, Dave has highlighted these very scary statistics of the notion of how long it takes to actually be detected. The fact that these adversaries in a cyber landscape are kind of hiding behind the scenes for over 200 days. This notion that, you know, 60% of people are actually clicking, if not more, right, are clicking on phishing scams. That, maybe it's just the English teacher in me, but that really is highlighting the notion that in our business continuity programs, it's not a notion, and we'll talk about this in future slides, it's not a notion about, not just a notion, I should say, on you know, becoming resilient and knowing what to do after an attack. It's a huge amount of training, and particularly what the firm you know, is great at is helping to do that culture change so that everybody from top to bottom to top is invested in protecting the business that they work for. Dave, I'll give the mic back over to you. My apologies for interrupting.
Okay, so moving on to IoT, the Internet of Things. This is probably another concept that most people are familiar with. You know, the numbers on this slide, you probably had a chance to take them in already, but they're just enormous. I mean, to have billions of devices on the network with spending into the trillions
Right.
by 2020 is just, it's just that, you know, and we're talking about a threat here that's only a few years old, right? So, you know, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, if you told me that, I was going to need to make sure in my risk management, business continuity planning process that I was accounting for the threat from my thermostat, I think I'd have had a hard time accepting that. But that is absolutely an issue today. And these are the devices that we're talking about. So let me take a step back. If you're not familiar with the Internet of Things, the concept is basically, these appliances and devices that nobody ever dreamed would be on the network, being on the network, so that you can program your thermostat over Wi-Fi and that sort of thing. So the challenge here, and I think I'm going to advance to the next slide because there's more content on that slide to take in, but there are a few challenges that the Internet of Things onset brings to risk management and business continuity planners. One is that manufacturers create products, and only within the last few years have those products been on a network. So never before that point has cybersecurity really been anything that these folks have considered, because frankly there hasn't been a need. They have their own cybersecurity folks internal to the organization that are worrying about traditional cybersecurity. But if I'm making a dishwasher or a thermostat or what have you, I have never thought about that at all. And now, it was almost like a light switch. As soon as you add that functionality to the product, cybersecurity and security in general becomes a threat, and threats in those spaces become prevalent, particularly cybersecurity because of the network aspect. So do these folks, does cyber or does security, does business continuity have a seat at their table? Prior to 3 or 4 years ago, why would they? And now we have to, I don't want to say rush, but we have to move quickly through the process of getting folks to seat at that table so we can say, all right, you're going to put the device on the network. There are certain protections that you, quote, need to put in place if you're, going to be responsible about putting this device on the network. Now, that's a tough sell, right? And security and business continuity professionals have no doubt dealt with that before. Now that has gotten much better, right? In the world, as far as business is concerned, security and business continuity gets a lot more attention and a higher priority than it ever has before. But again, we're basically starting that process from scratch with these folks who are manufacturing these devices. So to make things even more difficult, there's not a history of high-profile incidents that we can point to and say, look, that's what you don't want to happen. There's, unfortunately, a lot of times that is the primary motivator that precedes taking action. If you think about other data breaches, active shooter, so on and so forth, I mean, you don't need to tell anybody that threat is real because everybody knows that. But there's not an extensive history of exploits leveraging IoT or getting into a network through a thermostat because that functionality hasn't been around long enough for that history to exist. So that's a lot of challenges for folks like us. And I certainly don't mean to sound bleak, okay? I mean, these are challenges. It's not the first time in history that folks like us have had to deal with challenges. God knows that's true. So I'm quite sure that we will be resilient, pardon the pun, and overcome these challenges. But they are a bit daunting. We unfortunately we've chosen the more daunting challenges to focus on in this webinar because those are the ones that probably require the most attention, because they're the most difficult to persevere through. Andrea, anything to add here?
No, Dave, I'm good. As we advance to slide 12, And knowing that we're going to wrap it up here shortly. Another trend that we're seeing, predicting to continue to see in 2018, are various physical threats. Unfortunately, this is the environment that we all live in, and so it's really just a notion of knowing if any of these attacks do occur, what's our line of communicating to employees, communicating to our potential stopping of work, and how quickly can we get back into doing our work. Based on examples in the country and really all over the world, we see these particular threats of active shooter, workplace violence, improvised explosive devices, and insider threats. There's various statistics on here, so what I've actually done is included these gray bar graphs to explain that this is kind of on the rise for these active shooter events, and naturally we also do have workplace violence. The difference between that and insider threat is where we often say workplace violence would be the adversary is an employee. Insider threat. Adversary is an employee. Workplace violence could easily be someone connected to an employee, but not necessarily a part of the business, coming in and unfortunately doing damage. What's interesting about this trend is it's this constant theme of look at the entire spectrum. We're now seeing human resources become a part of business continuity because it's a notion of, again, notifying victims, doing background checks on employees before they're even hired, and figuring out these additional stress relief programs that HR can often implement in order to allow a space for people to air their grievances, and also for us to acknowledge if someone is so angry, in this type of an environment that maybe we need to actually offer them one-on-one services. So think to yourself with all of that physical landscape, and again, not just saying these are the common threats, but acknowledging what could actually help decrease the vulnerabilities within your organization. Dave, next slide, please. We are going to transition now into the impact on business continuity, and Dave hit on it earlier. It's really about planning. The next couple of slides are all about how you can include additional planning efforts into your program. What we concentrate on this slide about is three particular items. I'll quickly go over the first. And it's this renaissance of where physical and cyber meet. So again, acknowledging it's really not just about physical threats anymore, and it surely cannot just be about cyber because of So your business continuity program trend for 2018 is to really take a holistic look at what could be impacting our and planning for it every step of the way. Dave, I'll let you take over the last two.
Thanks. So, along similar lines, what we want to do as business continuity professionals is not limit ourselves just to cyber and not limit ourselves just to IT. So there's been, legacy-wise, a lot of conversation about the relationship between business continuity and IT. And while many of the functions that business continuity planners account for are systems, and likewise what we're doing with IT, they're not all. And while many practitioners out there are doing a better job of accounting for these things, like facilities, for example, it's still a trend and something that I think we need to continue our focus on. The third item here has to do with the role of us as practitioners, and that we should be positioning ourselves to asset owners or function owners as a trusted advisor. Again, I think that as an industry, we're pretty good at that. But leading into the next slide, I think getting back to our first point about the relationship between risk management and business continuity professionals, I think it's important to know that a very emerging trend in the risk management space is this concept of enterprise security risk management, which has a few tenets as far as, you know, the process there, you can see, and other things. But the one that's most important to this audience is that the risk manager is also positioning themselves as a trusted advisor to the asset owners. That is a bit of a change, right? So there's been a lot of culture historically where, you know, it's like, you know, I'm the all-powerful risk manager and I'm going to tell you what you have to do. A, people don't respond very well to that, and B, the asset owners don't have a stake in what's happening. So there's little motivation to take ownership. And by positioning ourselves as a trusted advisor and advising the client on, you know, the risks that are out there and the things we need to be mindful of, you know, from a planning perspective, the client is more involved, feels like they're contributing, takes more ownership, and overall we have more success. Andrew, any comments on that?
No, because you want to advance to slide 15. So this is where we start, team, to kind of conclude our slides for today. You know, business continuity professionals need to concentrate on the entire spectrum of planning. That's just a really good safeguard of acknowledging the risk and then the impenetrability on each side of those spectrums. Resilience is after boom, right? It's a measure of it happened, now what? We have to ask ourselves, man, are we totally crippled, or can we actually minimize the impact, be resilient, and start again? And how soon can we do that? On the other end of the pendulum, is the impenetrability. This is before boom. So our presentation today really acknowledges several trends where the threat is going to happen. It's just a matter of when and how prepared are you going to be because of your planning efforts. Your planning needs to be about the emergency response, and it needs to be about the impact to your business process or processes. Many do want to keep those two elements separate, but we can acknowledge that many words within this word bubble are synonymous with business continuity programs. Dave, next slide.
So on this slide, you know, in the interest of time, I think I'll cut to the chase on this slide. There's basically two main points that we want to take from this. One is that executive sponsorship, buy-in from the top, is paramount. I mean, the more of that you have, the more you can basically ride it down through the organization and not have internal adversity or be undermined by competing priorities. The second is a bit of an echo of business users, business leaders, functional owners, and positioning ourselves as an advisor to those folks.
Dave. So on our last slide, we really wanted to provide some of the low-hanging fruit. We know that a lot of trends are kind of the doom and gloom of the year, but some of these are the top actions and questions for executives and really any question the process. So the key action anyone can take, I'm going to change executives to anyone, is encourage or actually do put a senior executive at the helm. Map threats to the business assets that matter. Again, acknowledge that in that entire bucket of that circle of a component, where does it actually overlap? And those are going to be where we want to concentrate. Drive the early wins amongst your employees. As we drive early wins, we are actually accelerating the behavior change amongst the entire organization, and we are allowing a trust to build and really verifying that trust because we have those wins. People will start to say, okay, business continuity program is working. I also encourage people to think about, are we focused on the right talent? Are we proactive or reactive? And it's okay to be both. Are we incentivizing openness and collaboration? And are we adapting to the change of business continuity? With that being said, thank you so much for your time. We are going to stop our presentation and we will open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you, David and Andrea. It was a great presentation. Before we go to question and answers, I would like to talk about ISO standards. I would like to inform all the attendees that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 22301, Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. This training is designed to provide you with the required knowledge on how to continue to operate efficiently within a short period. Furthermore, a PCB certificate is known worldwide. For more information, please visit our website pcb.com/training. Now I will continue with some questions. Question number 1 is, how often do you assess the risks that are part of business continuity management, or what is the recommendation?
Excellent, I'll take that. What we encourage from a federal guideline perspective in the United States is absolutely at a minimum to do it yearly. We also acknowledge, though, based on all of those caveats we talked about, whether it's seasonal or some type of special event that's occurring, you would want to do the assessment at that time or in preparation of that time.
Thank you, Andrea. We have another question. You mentioned opportunity bring risks. Can you please explain a bit more this statement?
I can take that if you like.
Okay, that sounds great, Dave.
I think innovation is probably the best, clearest example of that. So, you know, I made a joke earlier about it. You know, if we would only stop innovating, we could probably get ahead of these risks that we face. And you know, I think the opportunity is a better word to use to illustrate the fact that obviously we shouldn't do that. We should continue to innovate, and we, as business continuity professionals, we don't want to be a hindrance or restrict growth of an organization, right? We want to be aligned with the overall goals and strategy of the organization. But when we do that, we open ourselves up to additional challenges, right? Because the innovation is going to continue. Every time a truly disruptive product or service or other innovation comes on the market or you know, becomes available to us, it comes with its own set of challenges, some of which, if that solution is truly innovative, we've never seen before.
Thank you, David. We have another question from our attendee. Should we integrate business continuity with information security and stop business continuity as a separate discipline?
Yeah, I think that would be really important to have that be a spectrum, because again, we often see that cyber topics are in the IT world only, yet acknowledging, because of everything we talked about with this convergence of physical and cyber, acknowledging that your business continuity program should absolutely include both IT, operational, and physical. Dave, what are your comments to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I would say that the risk to that, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because we don't know the organization and there are nuances from one to the next. But the risk of doing that, putting business continuity within information security, is that there would be natural blinders to anything that isn't information security. That would be the risk. And you know, personally, I would consider that you know, a significant risk. The advantage to having it as a separate organization is that it can literally span the entire organization. So you would have, you know, involvement with information security and with any other function within the organization that requires your services.
Thank you, Andrea and David. We have several attendees asking how to integrate risk management program and business continuity program.
You know, I think it starts with the relationship. And, you know, there are cases where those relationships are adversarial. I have been within, you know, I have experience with organizations there where it's adversarial and a bit competitive. And if you're in that situation, unfortunately, it can be very difficult to get aligned, right? I think integrate is a strong word. It kind of brings to mind images of, you know, merging the two organizations, and I'm not suggesting that happened, but that that those two organizations be aligned and you know, as we said before, basically take a step closer to each other in the life cycle of an incident. Definitely the starting point for that is the relationship. So if there is no relationship, or if it's unfortunately not a positive relationship, I would say it starts with trying to make that a positive relationship. And that may be, you know, lunches and, you know, starting with time that even, you know, it doesn't have any conversation related to work maybe. And once that relationship is starting to have some sort of foundation, to then tackle that and say, you know, work on getting people together. You know, again, if it's a difficult relationship, maybe it starts with a mixer, you know, but ultimately what you want to get to is exposure of the two departments to each other. And, you know, maybe lunch and learns and that kind of thing, where as you know, the business continuity group is learning about what the risk management group does and vice versa. And then, you know, at some point, hopefully it just kind of takes on a life of its own, and maybe people are interested in cross training and that sort of thing, and you know, temporary assignments in each group. So, you know, that's pretty advanced. I don't think you have to take it to that point, but the potential is there.
Thank you, David. We had many questions, but due to lack of time, we will answer only one more question, and the rest of them will be answered by David and Andrea via email. Last question is, which trends from 2017 will still be relevant for 2018?
That's a great question. You know, Dave, I can kind of give my 2 cents and definitely hand the mic over to you. Knowing that I have so much of a physical background, I hone in those a lot. I see that there's going to be the common trend and persistent trend, like we talked about in the presentation, of some of the physical threats, and then just the notion of technologies, that Internet of Things. That's really been where we've been at probably for the last 2 years, and only getting stronger and faster with it. So I see cyber and physical being a carryover from last year. Dave, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think I think, to be honest, several of the things that we talked about today are not newly emerging in 2018. I think to give you the opposite of the answer to your question, I think what is new in 2018 is the more effective response to some of these, you know, increasingly prevalent threats. I think that's what we'll start to see new in 2018. But you know, if we were doing this webinar a year ago, and we were talking about trends that we expect to see in 2017, I think we would have mentioned data breach. I think we would have mentioned IoT. I think we would have mentioned physical. You know, those will continue and probably will become more prevalent, unfortunately, in 2018. But I think the effective countermeasures and effective response from risk management and business continuity folks will increase substantially this year and in years to come, and hopefully we can get ahead of those threats.
Once again, thank you, David and Andrea, for this excellent presentation, and I want to thank all the attendees as well who have joined us today. We hope you enjoyed this webinar and you found it helpful. In the upcoming days, we will send you the recorded link, which will be uploaded on our official YouTube channel and in our website, pcb.com. On behalf of PCB, David and Andrea, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.